This morning, the Princess of Wales back on the global stage.
There was no warning, no whispered briefing to soften the moment, no gentle signal from palace aides that something unusual was about to happen. The cameras were already in place. The courtiers were already arranged. The room had that polished stillness royal events are trained to maintain, the kind of stillness that makes the monarchy appear eternal, even when the people inside it are carrying private storms. Then Camilla stepped forward wearing a brooch almost no one expected to see, a piece long believed to have been set aside in silence after Queen Elizabeth's death. And for one sharp, unforgettable second, Catherine did not move at all. It was not a stumble. It was not a theatrical reaction. It was something colder and more dangerous. She froze. And in that tiny break in royal composure, the entire country sensed that something far bigger than jewelry had just entered the room. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because this was not simply about a brooch, a sparkle, or a ceremonial choice. It was about memory, inheritance, hidden decisions, and the painful line between what belongs to a reigning queen and what is quietly preserved for the woman expected to carry the monarchy into its next stage. Britain thought it was watching another controlled royal appearance. What it may actually have witnessed was the opening sign of a private palace struggle that had been building for far longer than the public knew. What happened felt different immediately, because the brooch itself was not ordinary. Royal jewels are never just ornaments. They are signals. They carry history, rank, favor, grief, and continuity. A brooch in the royal world can mean affection, allegiance, remembrance, mourning, diplomacy, or succession. It can say what no statement will ever confirm. That mattered because this particular piece was linked not only to Queen Elizabeth's private collection, but to a hidden internal understanding that it would not be displayed casually, and certainly not by surprise, without first resolving questions of familial meaning and ceremonial precedence. Ceremonial precedence meant the visual order of importance within royal life, the placement of rank and future significance in public display. To ordinary eyes, a brooch is beautiful. Inside a palace, it can be explosive. The room knew it before the public did. That was the truly chilling part. Several senior aides looked up at once. One courtier who had been facing the receiving line shifted so sharply it broke the graceful rhythm of the event. William's expression changed only slightly, but in royal life, slightly can mean everything. And Catherine, standing only a short distance away, appeared to stop not because she was confused, but because she recognized the brooch immediately. Recognition is what made the moment dangerous. She did not freeze because she had never seen it. She froze because she had. The country saw glamour. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Camilla carried the moment with outward control. That was her discipline, learned over years of public hostility, private caution, and the long education of surviving within the most judged family in the country. She did not touch the brooch. She did not draw attention to it. She did not perform triumph. Yet the very restraint made the act more severe. It was not accidental. It was not some hurried choice from a velvet tray. It had been selected, fastened, approved for appearance, and worn into a room where Catherine would see it. In royal terms, that was enough to make the air heavier. The photograph spread within minutes. First came admiration, then curiosity, then the first wave of questions from royal watchers who know the language of these things. Why that brooch? Why now? Why without prior public mention? Why at an event where Catherine's presence had already carried symbolic weight because of her own careful return to visible duty? What made the sight so potent was not just the jewel's beauty, but its history. The late queen had worn it rarely and strategically. She had used certain pieces as emotional markers, not decorative habits. When she chose one, she usually had a reason. And within the household, there had long been quiet assumptions about what some of those pieces would come to mean after her death. Catherine's private reaction did not come in public words. She would never allow that. But later, behind a closed palace door where the cameras could not follow, and the smiles could finally disappear, the emotional truth began to show itself. Those present described her as composed but unnaturally silent, not angry in any loud sense, not tearful, something harder to read and therefore more serious. She asked only one question at first. Was this cleared? It was a simple sentence, but it carried the full weight of rank, memory, and alarm. William knew instantly what she meant. He had seen that brooch before, not in some display case open to guests, but during one of those deeply controlled private review sessions that follow the death of a sovereign. Grief in royal life does not arrive alone. It arrives with inventories, access registers, custodial notes, private wishes, archived distinctions, and careful conversations about what is personal, what is historic, and what must never be handled carelessly. Somewhere in that process, long before the public ever thought to ask about a hidden brooch, there had been a quiet understanding around the piece. Not a public announcement, not even a formal state paper, something more intimate and therefore more dangerous, a private expectation. The story did not begin that day. It did not even begin with Camilla fastening the brooch to her dress. It began much earlier, in the late Queen's final years, when the monarchy had already started living in the uneasy space between present reign and future reign, even while no one dared call it that out loud. In those years, Queen Elizabeth had become even more deliberate with symbols. People often misunderstood her silence. They took it for distance, or habit, or emotional restraint for its own sake. But the late Queen understood something few others ever mastered. The monarchy speaks most clearly when it says almost nothing. A hat color could signal purpose. A seating arrangement could reveal trust. A carriage pairing could calm a national mood. A brooch, worn at the right moment, could convey continuity more elegantly than any speech. That was why the household took her jewelry choices so seriously. They were not random adornments. They were a visual language. At one private luncheon, according to those who later reflected on the atmosphere of that period, the late Queen had discussed legacy in a manner more personal than usual. Not succession in the formal legal sense. Succession meant the automatic transfer of the crown to the next in line according to established constitutional rules. That was already set. What concerned her was something subtler, the emotional handover, the visual grammar of continuity. The way women entering or occupying great roles within the monarchy would be seen, accepted, and remembered. She knew that Camilla carried one history. She knew Catherine represented another future. And somewhere in that delicate landscape sat the brooch now, causing national shock. The piece itself had been inherited through a female royal line and was associated, not officially but deeply, with steadiness during transition. It had been worn in moments of national uncertainty and family change. It was never among the most publicly discussed jewels, which is exactly why its appearances mattered so much. It was a quiet signal, not a dazzling one. And the late Queen, by more than one private account, had once remarked that some jewels must wait for the right shoulders. That phrase stayed in the minds of those who heard it, because in royal life eye shoulders do not simply bear fabric. They bear expectation. Catherine had heard something similar in later years, though never in the form of a promise. The late Queen was far too disciplined for sentimental pledges dressed as ceremonial certainty. But there had been gestures, invitations to study pieces, brief remarks about burden and grace, a question once asked about comfort under attention, another about patience under misreading. These things sound small to outsiders. Inside the monarchy, they are remembered for years. They become emotional documents. What happened next requires going back to one particular evening at Windsor, shortly after Queen Elizabeth's health had become a private concern, even while public appearances continued with reassuring dignity. A small group had been invited to view several personal items tied to royal memory and female continuity. Not a spectacle, not a transfer, more like a reflective household exercise arranged under the late Queen's supervision, half archival, half personal. Catherine was present for part of it. Camilla was present for part of it. The atmosphere was respectful, measured, almost solemn. According to those familiar with that night, the hidden brooch was shown briefly, discussed lightly, then set aside with unusual care. The late Queen's words were few, but enough to leave a mark. Some things, she said, carry not just history, but timing. That sentence would later haunt everyone involved, because timing is the true battlefield in royal life. Not whether something happens, but when. Not whether a role exists, but when it is acknowledged. Not whether a future queen is being prepared, but when the public is allowed to feel it. Timing is how the monarchy protects the present without denying the future. And when timing goes wrong, pain follows. After the late Queen died, the household entered the controlled sorrow of transition. Charles became king. Camilla's position, long debated across decades, settled into formal reality. Catherine, as Princess of Wales, stepped into a role carrying both enormous public affection and unbearable historical comparison. For a while, the institution held its balance. The public saw unity. The machinery behind the scenes worked to keep it that way. The official household was the network of private secretaries, dressers, legal advisors, ceremonial officers, archivists, and senior staff who keep royal life functioning when emotion threatens to disrupt order. They were not there to create affection. They were there to preserve continuity. Yet beneath that continuity, questions remained uncomfortably alive. Which symbols now belonged naturally to Camilla as queen? Which should remain untouched out of respect for Elizabeth's memory? Which, if introduced too boldly, would provoke backlash? And which, perhaps most delicate of all, should quietly be preserved for Catherine? Not because she was queen yet, but because the monarchy was already thinking in decades. No one could ask those questions openly without sounding disloyal to the present reign. That was the trap. Camilla understood the trap better than most. She had spent years learning that every gesture she made would be read through history, criticism, and comparison. She knew what it meant to enter a role under suspicion. She knew what it meant to be measured against a ghost. She also knew, and this mattered deeply, that as queen, she could not live indefinitely in symbolic half-light, forever acting as though every meaningful gesture belonged to another woman's memory or another woman's future. The crown could survive many things, but not visible uncertainty at its center. A queen consort who appears tentative in her own place does not calm a monarchy. She weakens it. That was the logic she would later rely upon. But logic is not the same as wisdom. The trigger incident that transformed a private sensitivity into an open family fault line took place months before the public ever saw the brooch. It happened during preparations for a major state occasion, when pieces from the late Queen's collection were being reviewed for possible wear. Review sessions like these are not glamorous. They are highly controlled, deeply political, and emotionally charged. Dress advisors discuss visual balance. Archivists discuss provenance. Provenance means the recorded history of a piece, where it came from, who wore it, and under what conditions. Senior aides consider symbolism. Sometimes even constitutional advisors are consulted if a display could trigger public interpretation about status, succession, or family alignment. During that review, the brooch was reportedly raised and then set aside, not rejected, not assigned, simply set aside. That mattered because in royal households, setting something aside is often more significant than using it. It means the item is waiting for a question not yet resolved. Several people assumed the matter would remain dormant. Catherine, according to private accounts, was later informed in soft terms that the piece remained in a category of sensitive reserve. Sensitive reserve was not a legal term. It was the kind of internal phrase palaces create when they need caution without confrontation. Then something changed. In the weeks that followed, Camilla is said to have reopened the question privately with her own office. Her reasoning, if later accounts are correct, was not theatrical greed or open challenge. It was weariness. Weariness at endless symbolic caution. Weariness at living inside a hierarchy of emotional permissions, where every meaningful piece linked to Elizabeth seemed to belong either to the dead or to the future, while she, the reigning queen, remained in the narrow and exhausting space between. She reportedly asked a brutally simple question. If not now, when? That question reached Charles. Here the story turns from symbolic to deeply personal, because Charles was not merely a king navigating ceremonial meaning. He was a husband to Camilla, a son to Elizabeth, and a father increasingly aware that William and Catherine were not just beloved figures but the emotional future of the institution. Every choice touched all three realities at once. Those close to him say he hated such moments most, the moments when no one is wrong enough to dismiss, yet no one is right enough to vindicate. He had expected sensitivity. He had not expected a collision. The first private discussion between Charles and Camilla over the brooch was not explosive. No one raised their voice, but the room grew colder with every sentence. Camilla argued that as queen she could not perform permanent distance from the late queen's symbolic world. To do so would create a vacuum the public would feel. Charles replied that this was not about fear of public reaction alone. It was about sequence, family trust, and the invisible promises that are never written down and yet hold royal households together. Camilla asked whether unspoken impressions were now to govern a reigning queen more than her formal position. Charles did not answer quickly. That silence was answer enough. The truth was more painful, because both of them understood what neither wished to say clearly. The brooch had become a proxy. It stood for Camilla's uncertain place between acceptance and restraint. It stood for Catherine's advancing symbolic importance. It stood for the late queen's unseen influence over women who would define two eras of monarchy. And it stood for Charles's impossible burden of holding his marriage, his mother's memory, and his heir's future inside one fragile frame. For a time, the issue seemed contained. The brooch would remain unworn. The event would proceed without it. No public rupture, no family injury. That was the hope. But royal life has a way of burying tension rather than resolving it, and buried tension does not disappear. It ripens. Then came Catherine's gradual return to a more visible rhythm of public duty, and with it a new layer of symbolism around her. Every appearance mattered. Every photograph was read as recovery, dignity, and future strength. Crowds responded not only to her presence, but to what her presence represented. Resilience under pressure, continuity without noise, a younger face of royal steadiness. That rising emotional gravity around Catherine altered the meaning of everything around her, including jewels. Especially jewels. Camilla could feel it. She did not resent Catherine in the crude way tabloids often suggest. The truth was more complicated and therefore more painful. She respected Catherine's discipline, her instinctive understanding of public mood, the way she could embody continuity without appearing to reach for it. Yet respect does not erase displacement. Camilla had spent years earning her place beside Charles, only to find that the emotional future of the monarchy increasingly gathered around Catherine with a force no office could command and no argument could stop. That was the private weather before the public storm. When Camilla finally appeared wearing the hidden brooch, she did more than make a sartorial choice. She ended ambiguity. She answered her own question. If not now, when? Now. Catherine's freeze lasted only a heartbeat. Then the training returned. The expression softened. The posture corrected. The event moved on. But in monarchy, one heartbeat can travel across a nation if cameras are pointed in the right direction. Observers replayed the footage. Commentators slowed it down. Social media magnified what older generations watching live had felt instinctively in the moment. Something had happened that no press release had prepared them for. This was not a simple display of royal glamour. It was a breach in the emotional choreography of the family. Inside Kensington Palace, the reaction was immediate and severe in the only way royal reactions ever truly are, through silence, questions, and the sudden activation of private channels. William did not begin with outrage. He began with verification. Had the piece been formally released for use? Who signed off? Was the late Queen's private categorization of sensitive items ever updated? Had anyone informed Catherine in advance? These were not decorative questions. They were questions about process. And in royal institutions, process is how trust becomes visible. Catherine listened to the answers with that same stillness that had frightened people earlier. She did not complain about being hurt. She did not make the matter about personal preference. That was precisely why it struck so hard. Instead, she asked whether the household now considered every prior understanding open to reinterpretation if enough time passed and enough people grew impatient. It was a devastating question because it reached beyond jewelry into the heart of monarchy itself. If nothing privately understood remains secure, then the family does not run on trust. It runs on tactical timing. William's anger emerged later, in private and with extraordinary control. He requested a meeting with his father, not as a rebellious son, but as heir. That distinction mattered because an heir is never merely a child defending his wife. He is the future sovereign protecting the coherence of the institution that he will one day inherit. In that room, father and son were forced into one of the oldest royal confrontations of all. Present reign versus future reign, each trying not to wound the other while the structure around them creaks. Charles entered that conversation already bide-hired. He knew what William was going to say before the first word was spoken. He also knew William would not speak only for Catherine. He would speak for continuity, for symbolism, for the dangerous cost of public gestures that appear to raid the emotional inheritance of the next generation. William did not accuse Camilla of theft or vanity. He was too disciplined for that. Instead, he said something more cutting. He said the monarchy could survive many things, but not confusion about who is meant to carry what into the future. No one raised their voice, but the silence deepened. Charles defended the principle of Camilla's position. She was queen. She could not be reduced to decorative caution forever. William replied that rank alone does not settle symbolic inheritance. Some things are legally available and still institutionally unwise. That mattered because royal life is not governed only by law. It is governed by interpretation, memory, and national feeling. A state communication was a formal public statement of position. But what the monarchy wears is another kind of communication entirely. One often more powerful, because it appears wordless. William believed the brooch had spoken too loudly. Charles then asked the hardest question a father can ask a son in such a moment. Was this really about the institution, or was it about Catherine? William's answer came quickly. Both. He said pretending otherwise would insult them all. That answer stayed with Charles. Meanwhile, Camilla had her own private reckoning. She knew by evening that the appearance had landed worse than even her critics expected. She had not anticipated Catherine's visible reaction. That, more than the headlines, disturbed her. She had expected disapproval. She had not expected injury. And there is a difference. Disapproval can be fought. Injury enters the conscience. Those close to her say she spent that evening asking not whether the public would turn against her, but whether the family now saw the act as an assertion against Catherine's future. If they did, then the damage would not be limited to press cycles. It would become personal history. The palace machinery moved with unusual speed. The Lord Chamberlain's office was quietly consulted. The Lord Chamberlain is the senior official responsible for the practical and ceremonial framework of the royal household, and when that office becomes involved, it means a matter has crossed from private discomfort into institutional risk. Archive custodians were asked to re-examine internal classifications attached to selected personal pieces from the late Queen's collection. Briefing pathways were reviewed. Advisory notes were prepared on visual symbolism for upcoming engagements. Continuity planning was refreshed. Continuity planning meant ensuring that public confidence in the line and function of monarchy remains steady even when private tensions rise behind the scenes. This was not a legal crisis. It was, in some ways, more dangerous than that. It was a crisis of meaning. Broadcasters noticed the atmosphere before they understood the cause. Royal editors began using careful phrases like unexpected symbolism and questions over internal sensitivities. Newspapers moved faster. By morning, the front pages were full of language the palace dreaded. Hidden brooch, late Queen's private reserve, Catherine's reaction, family tension, symbolic snub. Commentators debated whether the public had witnessed a deliberate assertion by Camilla or simply a misjudged attempt to normalize her place within the royal jewelry tradition. The nation split not only along lines of loyalty, but along lines of memory. To some, Camilla was finally acting with appropriate confidence as queen. To others, she had crossed into territory that belonged not to office, but to legacy. Crowds gathered outside palace gates not because anyone expected a confession, but because the monarchy in moments like this becomes a stage on which the country looks for reassurance. They watched cars enter and leave. They studied body language in every arrival. A delayed appearance by one aide became rumor. An unscheduled vehicle became theory. Britain has always known how to read royal weather when the sky looks calm and the ground feels unstable. Princess Anne was brought into the inner conversation soon after, and that alone revealed the seriousness of the matter. Anne does not waste words, and the family knows it. She had known her mother's symbolic habits as few others had. She knew which objects were sentimental, which were strategic, and which were both. She also had little patience for emotional theater dressed as constitutional insight. When briefed on the situation, she reportedly listened in silence and then asked one devastatingly plain question. Was the brooch available, or was it appropriate? The distinction cut through every attempt to blur the issue. Available concerned access, appropriate concerned judgment. In royal life, judgment is everything. Her view, as later understood by those near the process, was unsparing. Camilla may have had a defensible claim to wear the piece in purely formal terms, but the choice had violated a more delicate order, one shaped by the late Queen's own instinct for timing. Anne did not frame it as a feud between women. She framed it as a failure to respect sequence. Sequence in monarchy is the invisible thread that allows transition to feel natural rather than competitive. Break sequence, and even ordinary gestures begin to look like contests. That interpretation intensified pressure on Charles. He now faced not merely a distressed Catherine, an angry William, and an unsettled Camilla, but the cold truth that several of the people who best understood the monarchy's internal language believed the choice had been wrong. Yet he also knew that abandoning Camilla publicly would create another kind of disaster. A queen openly diminished by her own household becomes a symbol of weakness. Weakness at the center of a reign spreads fast. This was not a problem that could be solved by choosing one woman over another. It was about how to preserve the present without humiliating it, while protecting the future without denying it. For 2 days, the palace considered options. No public correction would be made. That would feed the fire. No dramatic denial either. That would invite scrutiny of archive records and personal understandings no one wanted exposed. Instead, the strategy turned toward controlled rebalancing. Rebalancing in royal life means shifting emphasis without announcing retreat. It happens through appearance design, advisory sequencing, and the quiet redistribution of symbolic weight. The first sign came at the next major engagement. Catherine appeared wearing a different piece associated with long continuity and public service, one modest enough to avoid looking like retaliation and meaningful enough that those who understand royal signals felt the answer immediately. She did not reach for grandeur. She reached for steadiness. That was exactly why the move landed so powerfully. Camilla, by contrast, appeared in jewels of dignity but lower emotional charge. Not diminished, not humiliated, simply repositioned. The message was clear to those trained to see it. The palace was cooling the temperature without admitting the fire. Still, the human wound remained. Catherine and Camilla could not simply glide past one another, as though nothing had happened. A private meeting was arranged, not to dramatize peace, to prevent future fracture. The setting was quiet, almost painfully polite. Tea was served, doors were closed, no staff remained within hearing distance. Two women who had learned, in very different ways, how brutal royal symbolism can be were finally left with the one thing monarchy hates most: direct honesty. Camilla spoke first. She said she had not intended to wound Catherine. She said the choice had come from exhaustion with perpetual caution, not from a wish to trespass on Catherine's future. Catherine listened, then answered with restraint so complete it made the room heavier. She said the issue was not ownership in any small sense. It was trust. She had believed certain things would be handled with care, especially those that carried the late Queen's emotional fingerprint. If that care could be overridden without warning, then every future gesture would become harder to read and harder to trust. The truth was more painful because both women were right in ways that could not comfortably coexist. Camilla was right that a reigning queen cannot live forever as a temporary figure inside another woman's memory. Catherine was right that the monarchy depends on honoring symbolic sequence, especially when the future is already visible to the public. No one could win that argument cleanly. That is why it lingered. When Charles later met Catherine privately, the conversation was said to be gentler, but no less serious. He did not defend the pain away. That mattered. He acknowledged the effect of the appearance, acknowledged the unique symbolic burden she carries, and acknowledged, perhaps more clearly than before, that the path between the present queen and the future queen could no longer be managed through assumption. It required structure. Structure is what monarchy uses when trust alone has become too fragile. Catherine, in turn, did not ask for guarantees. She asked for clarity. And clarity in royal life is a rare and costly thing. From that point onward, internal jewel protocols were reportedly tightened. Not publicly, never publicly, but enough to prevent another such surprise. Archive notes were cross-checked with ceremonial planning teams. Sensitive pieces were flagged for principal-level review. Advisory channels between the King's office and the Wales household became more deliberate. These sound like dry administrative steps. They were not. They were the architecture of emotional damage control. The public, of course, could see only the outer signs. They saw that Catherine and Camilla remained courteous. They saw that Charles kept both women visible in carefully measured ways. They saw William stand closer to Catherine in the weeks that followed, not possessively, but protectively. They saw Anne's public composure sharpen into something almost severe whenever questions of royal continuity arose nearby. And above all, they saw that the palace never fully relaxed after the Brooch incident. Once symbolism has broken through the surface that dramatically, everyone in the system becomes more careful. Yet the most powerful scene came later, and it came without a word. At a solemn public engagement tied to remembrance and continuity, the royal family emerged in a formation that looked ordinary until one studied it properly. Charles walked at the center of the present. William was not far from him. Catherine stood poised with a calm that seemed deeper now, not lighter. Camilla was there, dignified, composed, but carrying herself with a new restraint, as though she understood that certain symbols must not be forced, only received in time. No one mentioned the brooch. No one needed to. The arrangement itself had become the statement. The monarchy was not choosing spectacle over stability. It was choosing sequence over impulse. That image mattered because it reframed everything. This was not a petty quarrel over treasure. It was a painful lesson in how the crown survives. Not by pretending emotion does not exist, but by disciplining emotion so that the institution can keep moving. The family remained bruised. The trust was not unbroken, but the structure held. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all. The monarchy can survive scandal. It can survive criticism. It can even survive periods of coldness within its own walls. But it cannot survive carelessness with meaning. Meaning is what gives the crown its strange endurance. A brooch becomes more than metal because generations have poured memory into it. A glance becomes more than a glance because the world knows these people are trained never to reveal too much. A freeze becomes more than a pause because it tells the truth before language can cover it. In the end, what the country witnessed was not simply Catherine freezing as Camilla appeared, wearing Queen Elizabeth's hidden royal brooch. It was the collision of three female eras inside one living monarchy. The late Queen, still shaping the room through memory and symbol. Camilla, trying at last to stand fully inside the place history had given her at such cost. Catherine, carrying the unspoken gravity of what is coming, and feeling in one sudden instant how fiercely the present can reach toward symbols the future had quietly been taught to revere. This was not about fashion, it was about sequence. It was not about vanity. It was about legitimacy in emotional form. It was not about one woman taking something from another. It was about what happens when private understandings are tested against public rank. That mattered because the monarchy has always depended on invisible agreements, the soft restraints no law can write and no court can easily enforce. Once those restraints fray, every public image becomes heavier, every jewel becomes a question. Every appearance becomes a negotiation between love and duty, present and future, authority and tenderness. And still, for all the pain, the family did not break. Charles kept walking. William stood firm. Catherine did not retaliate. Camilla did not collapse into public defensiveness. Anne held the line of old discipline. The monarchy chose control over chaos, sequence over spectacle, and careful rebalancing over public humiliation. That is not the same as peace. But in royal life, peace is often too much to ask. Continuity is the greater prize. So when the doors closed at the end of that long and terrible week, and the cameras were left to interpret smiles that concealed too much to name, one image remained above all others. Catherine, still and silent for one brief second, as history flashed on another woman's shoulder, then recovering with the composure of someone who understood at once that the country had seen a crack in the surface, and that she, more than anyone, would now have to help ensure the surface did not shatter, because the monarchy had chosen preparation over denial, because love and duty could no longer remain in exactly the same form, because the future had been acknowledged without being formally announced, and because behind every glittering royal object lies the most
It had
dangerous
proved the
truth
chapter
of all.
was still
In a
tender,
palace,
still
nothing
guarded,
precious is ever
still
only
capable
worn.
of shaking
It
the
is
room.
inherited, interpreted,
Anne found
delayed,
Catherine later
protected,
and spoke with
sometimes
blunt
fought over in
kindness.
silence.
The Princess
Thanks for
Royal
watching.
told her that
Please
what
do
she
not
did
forget
was
to
not
like and
defiance.
subscribe,
It
and we
was
will see you in
stewardship.
the next one.